Hello everybody, this is the webinar style recording of a presentation that Peter Dye and I, Bill Lewis from the Oglethorpe International Study Center gave at the Georgia IEP mini conference. The presentation is titled Teachers or Tutors, Strategies for Small Classes. The situation we're thinking about is one that we may have found ourselves in. You've spent weeks, months, or maybe even years planning a series of communicative activities involving group work, debates, musical chairs, presentations, etc. But for whatever reason, you end up with a smaller group than you had expected. It's hard to have a debate with 3 students, it's hard to pair off with 5, and presentations simply aren't as effective when students are presenting to mostly empty desks. While small classes are idealized in many ways, and do hold a range of advantages for students and teachers, they also come with their own set of challenges. So today we'd like to introduce a few strategies that can help teachers to be more adaptive in these small classroom settings. Before moving on, it's probably worth getting more specific. What we mean by small classes are very small classes, or classes of 4, 5, 6 students, maybe 7. So some of the challenges that come with very small class sizes, the first is that communicative language teaching really does work best with 12, 13, 14, or 15 students, maybe even more. All of the basic methodology that we've learned in graduate school was designed for a much larger group. So our activities do need to be modified. And the central problem is that there is a lack of student-to-student interaction, which is where much of the language learning is actually done through these meaningful or meaning-focused interactions that students have in class. This is a huge challenge and one that our solutions will attempt to explore. Another challenge is just personal dynamics. When you have a small room or a small group of people, any sort of disagreement or any inability to work together is amplified by the small group. So it is a little bit more delicate, and we do have to manage those relationships a little bit more carefully than we would in a larger group. These small classes require us to make changes to our plans, both at the micro and macro level. At the micro level, we're thinking about activities that need to be modified, and at the macro level, we might be thinking about assessments, timelines, and perhaps even course goals and objectives that might need to be modified to better suit this small number of students that we have. There's also some change in the roles for both teachers and students. Teachers will find that their role as teacher as presenter or teacher as performer might not work as well if there's only 3 students in the class. They might have to quite literally pull up a chair and sit with the students together to work through activities. They might also find that they need to pretend to be a student in a pair activity in order to carry out that activity. In smaller classes, students might be more likely to confide in their teacher, more detailed personal information, and the teacher might find that their role has shifted more to align closely with that of an advisor or a counselor. Student roles also change. Any student intending to sit quietly at the back, even if they were intending to do that diligently, is going to have a very hard time in a group of 3 because there is literally nowhere to hide. So these are all adjustments that need to be made. There are benefits to these small class sizes. The first and foremost, and perhaps most obvious, is that it allows us to give more individual attention to learners. This could be in the form of feedback, out-of-class meetings, in-class meetings, and some solutions that we'll talk about later are aimed at taking advantage of this individual attention that we can provide. These small classes also allow us to be a little bit more innovative. If an activity that you're doing with a group of 30 fails, it can be quite hard to get that group back on track. But if something fails in a group of 3, if you try something new and it doesn't work, it's fairly easy to get that group back on track. Additionally, while we're replanning activities that we had already planned, we might find innovative new ways to improve on the things that we had been doing, which is not to say that those things hadn't been good, but that thinking about something again can allow us to improve upon what we were doing. We're also likely going to find that we have deeper connections to the students. We're going to know more about them, and that's, I would argue, always a good thing. And the relationships that they form with each other and that they form with you are likely to be a little bit deeper than if your attention was divided amongst a group of 30 or 35. And lastly, this might seem shallow on the surface, but the grading in admin is, of course, reduced, the amount of grading in admin that one has to do. This does seem shallow because it seems like we're trying to get out of work, but in truth, the extra time that we have that we're not spending on grading and administrative things, we can apply to higher sorts of goals, like finding new approaches, new ways, new tools to bring into the classroom, and this is definitely a benefit. So in this presentation, we're going to propose 3 sets of solutions, or 3 baskets of solutions. The first of which is ways to foster learner autonomy in a small classroom. Then we'll discuss some ways to use technology in these small classrooms. And once we've covered those 2, we'll talk about ways to get outside of the class. So the first set of solutions we're going to talk about have to do with learner autonomy and ways that we can use a small class to foster this generally good attribute of a learner. As is always the case, we should start with a definition. I'll give you a second to enjoy the cartoon. This, of course, is not a definition of learner autonomy, but an example of what happens when autonomy goes wrong. A good definition, it's not the most recent, nor is it the most extensive, but it really does quickly capture the idea. And it comes from Hulk in 1981, and it's simply that learner autonomy is the ability to take charge of one's own learning. And for our purposes here, I think this definition will suffice. As I mentioned, this is a widely agreed upon good attribute of a learner, and as we would expect, there are connections to motivation, self-regulation, and outcomes or performance in a class. And generally these are positively correlated. Learners who are more autonomous are generally more motivated. They're better able to self-regulate or track their own progress, and they do slightly better in assessments. For a framework that will allow us to foster autonomy in a ideally small classroom, we can turn to the negotiated syllabus, which was written about by Breen and Littlejohn, most notably in 2000. This is also in some places referred to as a process syllabus, which may be familiar to you. Simply stated, the negotiated syllabus is one in which the teachers and students work together to make decisions about a course. The decisions can have to do with any sort of layer of the curricular planning, from the very specific content or task issues all the way up to the larger goals and assessments. To give you a few examples, decisions about content in a reading course, we could have reading A be something about panda bears and reading B be something about politics, and instead of the teacher deciding which one's more appropriate, we could open that up to a discussion and have the students come to a decision together about the content of the course. The same could be true in a grammar class, but we might be negotiating over what forms will be covered, whether the perfect tenses are important, or the past perfect, or the simple perfect, any discussion like that. And the same could be true of any listening that was going to be used in a class, or certain topics that we might want to cover. Getting a little bit larger, we can also negotiate things around procedure. So this could be issues that have to do with deadlines. The amount of group work is also a procedural question. The teacher's involvement could be a procedural question that could be discussed together and agreed upon as a group. Slightly larger, we can, sort of an extension of the content level, we can debate the units to cover. In most EAP textbooks, there are more units than are needed, and usually the teacher makes those decisions in advance in order to plan. But using a negotiated syllabus, we can open discussions around which units to cover and which units to skip. We might find that the unit that we find mind-numbingly boring is actually something that's of great interest to our students, and why not allow them to tell us that. At the largest level, we can open up discussions around goals and assessments. For assessments, it could be how students will be assessed, whether it's a few large exams or a number of smaller stakes quizzes, or giving them the choice of a paper or a presentation or a poster in order to demonstrate their understanding. And the important point here is that there are many ways for a student to demonstrate understanding or mastery of some material, and allowing them some choice in how they do that is one thing that we can do through a negotiated syllabus. We can also have them come up with goals for themselves in advance of the unit or the course, and we can put those goals that they have written in conversation with the goals that we have, the goals and objectives that we have in our curriculum, and we can see where they line up and where they don't line up, and some worthwhile discussions can come out of comparing those two sets of goals. Of course, we don't want the students to be totally driving the bus, so to speak, but we do want to know what their goals are and how they match or don't match with the goals that we have for the course. Some tips for implementing a negotiated syllabus. First and foremost, we need to establish credibility and control before giving up control. This is one of the many Zen paradoxes of teaching, and maybe of life. But what's important here is that it's a good idea to wait a few weeks before opening up these discussions. We need to give students a model, show them what's expected in terms of behavior and workload and pace of the class, and allow them to, by sitting in on the class for a few weeks, maybe below the level of their awareness, come to some understanding about what it's like to be in so-and-so's class. And they can use this information when they're thinking about things they would like to bring, or things they'd like to ask for through negotiation. And this will help things go a little bit smoother. This approach does require a lot of careful scaffolding, planning, and clear choices. Our students are not experts in language pedagogy, so we can't turn this all over to them. And when we're offering choices for various ways to maybe assess their understanding of some material, we have to come up with those choices in advance, and we have to be comfortable with all of those choices in advance before allowing them to choose which among the smaller set we would be comfortable with them taking. We also do need to plan these discussions, and have procedures around that, and share that information with students so they know what they're getting into before it's begun. We also have to consider behavioral readiness. This is probably true of any pedagogical decision, but particularly in this case, because we are turning over some control to the students. We have to consider issues like age, background, previous educational experience, and we can't ask too much of them. If they are a younger group, or a group that's demonstrated a little less maturity, then maybe we want to be cautious in how much we throw open for negotiation. But for more experienced students, for more mature students, we can have a discussion about nearly anything, provided that there's planning and choice involved. Lastly, we do need to manage cultural expectations. This approach might seem strange to some students. It might seem to them like the teacher's running away from their responsibility to plan and execute instruction. In order to deal with this challenge, we do need plenty of meta discussion about what's happening, why it's happening, and we need to carefully frame this and explain it in advance, and also go slowly at the start. There are numerous benefits to implementing a negotiated syllabus, and we'll run through a few of them now. The first is that this approach acknowledges the perceived needs or wants of students. Often our needs analysis is very teacher-focused. We take raw data, maybe in the form of pretests, and we put it through our own filter, and we turn that into a document of what we think students need or want. But by opening this up to negotiation and doing it throughout the semester, we can actually tap into their genuine perceived needs or wants, and we can do it over and over again to see those needs and wants as they change throughout the course of the semester. This approach also can help raise students' awareness of their own goals and raise awareness of the course goals. By opening up the curriculum objectives and showing them what's inside of the course and where we're intending to go, we're making students more aware of our side, and by asking them to articulate their own goals, they're becoming more aware of where they're going and why they're going there. And then, of course, we want to put the students' goals and the curricular goals into conversation with each other and get to that better understanding. Studies show that students can become more self-directed as a result of a negotiated syllabus. A study from 2006, which was took place at a Thai university in an EAP reading course. Students selected most of the texts for the course, and pre and post tests revealed that they were significantly more likely to report an ability to self-direct their learning beyond that course when it came to reading, as a result of having some choice along the way. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the negotiation itself is actually meaning-focused practice. There's relatively high stakes when these negotiations are going on, and students are likely to be very invested, and they're going to be invested at the meaning level rather than an accuracy or a cosmetic level. For a sort of extreme and anecdotal example of this, we can think of a student who might have sat relatively disengaged at the back of a class during the period, but then at the end, when there was a discussion around a homework assignment or an upcoming test or quiz, became very, very involved and invested and vocal. If you take that sort of example and you apply it in a more structured and organized way throughout the semester, you might see how this negotiation would provide the practice that students actually do need, which is to say practice around meaning. Now, to bring this section to a close, I'm going to turn it over to Calvin and Hobbes because, as with most things that involve human experience, they're just as good at explaining it as we are.
Okay. Well, another way to vary your methods of instruction, and building off of Bill's point of fostering autonomy, is to incorporate more technology into your small classes. According to a Michigan State University study investigating laptop use in an introductory psychology course, the average time spent browsing the web for non-class related purposes was 37 minutes of a 1 hour and 50-minute class. Considering how much time students are using or being distracted by various tech, we might as well harness those tools for learning. So what are the benefits of increasing the amount of internet use in the classroom, particularly pertaining to mobile devices? In 2018, it's far from a foreign concept for students, and it can bring added engagement and motivation. It's easily accessible, user-friendly, and one huge benefit of these websites and mobile apps we'll take a look at is they're available after the course or class is finished. Students can potentially be more inclined to revisit an application to study vocabulary than they might be to reopen a textbook after the course is finished. Additionally, most of the things we'll look at today, in fact I think all of them, are free, which can be a wonderful addition for us teachers. There are specific benefits for small classes in particular, one being that it can divert focus from the strictly strictly teacher-student dynamic. With a group of 3 to 5, it's very easy for students to get bored with the teacher and vice versa. So incorporating technology can add variety and offer more opportunities to engage your students. It also provides advantages for different types of learners. If quieter students tend to hide or be less inclined to participate in discussions, they might be more participatory when working on a mobile app that's engaging and interactive. In the same way, if you have a very vocal student that might tend to dominate discussions, this could channel that energy in a different direction. And the last benefit for small classes is these kind of web-based learning applications can connect students to outside of the classroom. Instead of seeing the same 3 faces every class and hearing the same 3 voices, expose them to as many and as diverse amount of different people and perspectives as possible to meet your learning objectives. We'll look at the applications of various websites and applications that fall into 2 main baskets: web-based language learning and mobile-assisted language learning. These can be particularly effective in helping us work with small classes. However, the tools I'll introduce will certainly be helpful additions to any teacher's toolkit regardless of size. If you're interested in any specific tool referenced in this presentation, a complete list of links as well as the names of the apps will be included in a slide at the end of the presentation. Think of your regular assignments on the course syllabus and consider new ways to merge them with some of the free tools we have available online. For example, incorporate blogging. You could assign your students to different topics or have them choose. Students can upload class writing assignments as opposed to turning them in on paper, and a commenting feature can allow peer and teacher interaction and feedback. Consider incorporating journaling websites or applications in your writing classroom. You could use a few minutes at the beginning or the end of every class for students to journal, and these could be checked for completion or used to brainstorm for bigger writing assignments. We're all probably familiar with Google Docs, but there's a lot of different possibilities for incorporating these into existing writing assignments. It can allow for collaborative feedback, collaborative writing, as well as peer and teacher comments related to writing strengths and weaknesses that can help us improve and keep an online record that can help students chart their improvement over time. Additionally, think of creative ways to use email writing assignments. This is something we all use every day. It's incredibly practical. Students could practice sending emails to a variety of recipients, professor, friend, company, boss, party planner, etc. A great way to practice tone, style, grammar, and use it with existing resources we have like Grammarly. Grammarly can help us as native speakers or non-native alike as a learning tool, but also to help us avoid some of these common mistakes. Another useful resource that can help students be less reliant on you as their teacher and more reliant on themselves and their ability to conduct their own research is internet-based corpus tools. There's many different resources available for using corpora in the classroom, but the one I'll look at briefly here is COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English. This can be particularly helpful in allowing students to discover language patterns for themselves, to test and confirm language assumptions, support language intuitions with data. So for example, if a student asks you what preposition most commonly follows the verb get, instead of giving them your best guess or basing it off of your own ideas, help them and train them to use resources like COCA. So the example here, get followed by prep as the abbreviation for preposition. They can find all of the most common prepositions followed by the verb get, categorized by frequency. And this can be a really helpful tool when students come to you with questions about how common is this expression or how common is this word. Take it a step further, let them look at the terms in context to try to decipher the meaning for themselves. They can look at things like which words tend to precede the words in question and also what types of words tend to come after. They can see that this is common in the example here on the screen in news articles, and all of this information can help them be better informed in deciphering these patterns and hopefully producing them themselves. In the same way that we can look at varied methods for our students' writing assignments, same can be done with presentations. So think of creative new tools that can complement presentations that students already need to complete or have in your class in the past. One example could be story maps. Several teachers commented in the past about how this helped their students with various assignments. One teacher mentioned when reading Homer's Odyssey, this was a great tool for mapping out all the locations found in the story, and it caused their students to have to return to the text to confirm those choices. Another thing is have your students create movies related to the various presentations. You can do this individually or in groups. You can watch it in a class or online, but this can be a great way for language production, collaboration, discussion. In particular, in a small class, when you don't have a big audience, let the audience be the camera, or let the audience be the student, and he or she can give feedback about their own performance, and it can be a great way to chart your language improvements over time, much like it is with the digital copies of their writing assignments. Another idea that could be incorporated is the 2018 version of a pen pal, Skype Pal. This is a great link I recommend checking out with Brazilian kids that wanted to learn English, paired up with elderly Americans in a nursing home. And it filled two needs, the language need, but also the need for friendship for the older Americans. It's a real tearjerker of a video, but it proves an interesting point that we have all these opportunities to practice the language. And I think with a little creativity as teachers, we can help students arrange brief conversations via Skype to build on these language skills. This could be with a native speaker on campus, could be another student from a different section of your course, maybe has more students. It could be task-based or conversation-based, or even just to make a friend. And this could also be something where the students could report back on their experiences, what they heard about pronunciation, or various other features that you're trying to cover with your course objectives. To get away from that potentially repetitive dynamic with a small group of teacher talking, students listening, try to incorporate some other styles of presentation, different speakers online. And again, give the students some added agency, some added decision making to choose some of these videos related to your course objectives. One that we all know, TED Talks. TED Ed specifically has a lot of great resources for teachers attached to these videos that can be a great addition to any classroom. Think about different news sites that could be incorporated into your class to practice different objectives. Often some of these come with transcripts, such as NPR. BBC Learning English has a wealth of interactive materials online, or let students use News and Slow English to practice and potentially write reflections about or share their experience with a group of what they learned from these types of activities. Manythings.org is also a great resource for listening to speech samples of native speech, with pauses, with contractions that can be a great addition to pronunciation instruction. Let students choose based on their level. Let them choose things to listen to based on topics they enjoy. And lastly, we all know YouTube and what a valuable resource it can be in the classroom. TeacherTube specifically is geared towards educational materials, but any YouTube video could be potentially helpful for our learning objectives and helping our students to remain engaged and motivated while covering various different parts of the English language. Once again, because of the temptation to take out smartphones so often, why don't we put them to good use? And there are a range of ways to do this. For example, if you have an iPhone, Voice Memos is an app that's already included on your phone. This could be a great opportunity for students to record voice samples. It could be stories, presentations, reading responses, and submit for teacher feedback, peer feedback, or they could provide their own feedback on their fluency with the language. There's also a range of other tools like Quizlet, Magoosh for vocabulary learning. These can be particularly helpful for memorizing academic word lists, TOEFL vocabulary. And again, the great thing about it is if it's already with them, They can tap into this outside of class while they're waiting on the bus or during a commercial break during their favorite TV show. Other apps such as Kahoot or another not listed here, Poll Everywhere, great opportunity for interactive reviews before an exam, for kind of incorporating games into learning. There are a range of applications specifically for practicing academic vocabulary. Additionally, there's some engaging apps like Memrise here that matches memes or images with various vocabulary for practice. That could be a big hit for some students for sure. Google Translate we all rely on heavily, but we could have students use this app to test the translation accuracy of recent learned vocabulary and report on it or offer better translations potentially. In recent months, this Google Arts and Culture selfie app has been very popular, where you match your selfie with a famous portrait. You could have students research and present on the piece of art that they were matched with. There's also other apps not listed here, depending on your group of learners, like WeChat for your Chinese learners or KakaoTalk for your Korean learners. They could be used for timed recordings or various peer feedback. Could help, again, with interactive English practice in a variety of ways. Teachers should remember when using these tools in the classroom to be explicit in connecting the app, website, program to the learning goals and also how students can use them for learning, in class, autonomously. Using these tools in class can be helpful in promoting interactivity as well as training and directing from the teachers on how to properly use them for specific goals. I know all these websites and apps that were looked at can be a bit overwhelming if you're not familiar with them. It can be time consuming as a teacher to investigate a ton of new tools. So another application for these and other resources could be to assign individual students or pairs a site or an app to investigate, and maybe they could report on the pros and cons of each. And once again, at the end of the presentation, all of these websites and apps will be listed if you or your students might want to investigate them further. We've looked at promoting autonomy as well as incorporating technology as potentially helpful strategies for small classes. The last thing we'll explore are some new ways and ideas to take students outside of the classroom. There are several practical advantages to taking students outside of the class. It can provide them with authentic applications for the language studied. It can even be a part of your course if planned appropriately. It's much easier to do with small groups. Taking 5 to 10 students on a trip throughout the city, across campus, is much easier than doing it with 30. And it can also provide students the opportunity to learn by doing in a hopefully practical and potentially memorable way. There are some considerations like the planning that goes into these trips. However, in the next slide we'll look at applications for letting students be a part of this planning. Back to the idea of autonomy, give them leadership roles and decision-making tasks. There are things like cost and travel to consider, but I think with a little planning and a little creativity, these are things that can be accomplished. Here's an example we'll look at of how students could be given more responsibility and leadership in planning these trips. So if you consider the example of here in Atlanta, the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site. Before the trip, instead of the teacher having to plan everything, you could assign different parts of the trip to different students. One student could research historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, while another could plan the portion related to King's birth home. Students could be given and should be given specific roles. One student could function during the trip itself as the photographer, another as the videographer, a guide, interviewer, note taker, etc., to keep them engaged and active, but also very aware of their specific responsibilities. And make it clear to students that after the trip, they'll be responsible for writing a reflective paper or giving a presentation about what they learned in an effort to practice the skills and the vocabulary that they were exposed to on the trip. So by thinking about it as pre, during, and post, and giving students as much of an investment in the planning as the teacher, it can help them to recall the information learned and be more invested in the trip as a whole. There are various ways we can get the students out of the classroom and out into the world. For example, surveys can be a great way to have students interview people around campus or the local community. They could target cultural, political, linguistic topics related to course objectives. Additionally, scavenger hunts could be a useful way to practice language skills. Students could be assigned locations or different people to go interact with. Local field trips can be a great way to explore the area. This could be sporting events, markets, holiday events. We recently took a group to an international farmers market, and the classroom applications here are endless. You could assign students to find a food, a spice, a beverage from their country and maybe report on it, or find something they never heard of and share their findings with the group. Service-based learning also holds so much possibility for helping students learn by volunteering with local organizations. The top picture here is Oglethorpe University students working with Habitat for Humanity. It can be such a memorable and interesting way to practice language skills as well as build relationships. Find ways for students to take advantage of resources on campus, writing centers, tutoring centers. After their visit, they could report on what they learned or give advice for future students on how to use these resources. And again, this can be both engaging but practical skills and ways to use them. Lastly, have students find clubs on campus that they could get involved with related to their interests, their hobbies, possibly their language background or cultural background. The goal here is just to find new ways to get them interacting with people, and I think with a little creativity, any teacher can find there's a wealth of resources that could be used to get students interacting with new people. So in summary, these are just a few of our thoughts related to these three big ideas today: fostering autonomy, incorporating technology, and getting our students outside the classroom that can be particularly applicable to small classes. We are just skimming the surface of the many possibilities in these areas that can be pursued with a little creativity and planning, while giving increased responsibility and higher stakes on the student end of things.
Now, just a few last points to bring this presentation to a close. The first is that good small group teaching is just good teaching. All of the basics of pedagogy and educational psychology and principles of memory that would guide us in a class of 15 or 50 also work in a group of 5. So we have to keep those in mind. We don't need to reinvent our approach. We just need to modify it. It's a good idea to keep many aspects of the classroom the same. If, for example, we write an agenda on the corner of the board at the beginning of every class period with a larger group, we should continue to do that with a small group. There also might be a desire to just hold class in your office or in some other informal space. But that can really change the dynamic of the meeting, and it can begin to feel less like a class. So we'd encourage you to keep meeting in the classroom, even if you don't need all of the space that's provided. There's also a tendency just to think with a very small group that you can improv. But in fact, we almost need to plan more carefully for these small groups. If we're working with a negotiated syllabus, for example, we might need to plan 2 or 3 different routes through the course. So do keep that in mind. And finally, this is a great chance to be creative and to have fun and to try new things. So we totally encourage you to experiment and have fun.
Thank you so much for listening today. On this slide, you'll find a list of all of the websites and mobile applications that were discussed in the presentations. I hope you'll find something helpful here for your students and some applications for improving your small class sizes in the future.